So we are in book 2 of Tale of Two Cities. Book the second is called The Golden Thread, which you automatically think about Lucy because she's been described as having golden hair. So that's going to come back and be really important. So chapter 1, so the way you'll see me talk about it in class is 2.1, is called 5 Years Later. So literally the book is picking up 5 years after we last saw Mr. Lorry, Lucy, and Dr. Manette coming back over from France. So right now the year is 1780. Okay, so it says Tellson's Bank, which is where Lorry works, by Temple Bar, was an old-fashioned place, even in the year 1780. It was very small, very dark, very ugly, very incommodious. It was an old-fashioned place, moreover, in the moral attribute that the partners in the house were proud of its small incommodiousness. They were even boastful of its eminence in those particulars, and were fired by an express conviction that if it were less objectionable, it would be less respectable. There was no passive belief, but an active weapon which they flashed at more convenient places of business. Tellson's, they said, wanted no elbow room. Tellson's wanted no light. Tellson's wanted no embellishment. Noakes and Co. might, or Snooks Brothers might, but Tellson's, thank heaven. Any one of these partners would have disinherited his son on the question of rebuilding Tellson's. In this respect, the house was as much on par with the country, which did very often disinherit its sons for suggesting improvements in laws and customs that had long been highly objectionable, but were only the more respectable. So Tellson's is very old-fashioned, is basically what we're supposed to understand. Thus, it had come to pass that Tellson's was the triumphant perfection of inconvenience. After bursting open a door of idiotic obstinacy, with a weak rattle in its throat, you fell into Tellson's down 2 steps, so you go downstairs to get into Tellson's Bank, and came to your senses in a miserable little shop with 2 counters where the oldest of men made your check shake as if the wind rustled it, while they examined the signature by the dingiest of windows, which were always under a shower bath of mud from Fleet Street, and which were made the dingier by their own iron bars proper and the heavy shadow of Temple Bar. If your business necessitated your seeing the house, you were put into a species of condemned hold at the back, where you meditated on a misspent life, until the house came with its hands in its pockets, and you could hardly blink at it in the dismal twilight. Your money came out or went into wormy old wooden drawers, particles of which flew up into your nose down your throat when they were opened and shut. Your banknotes had a musty odor as if they were fast decomposing into rags again. Your plate was stowed away among the neighboring cesspools, and evil communications corrupted its good polish in a day or 2. Your deeds got into extemporized strong rooms made of kitchens and sculleries, and fretted all the fat out of their parchments into the banking house air. Your lighter boxes of family papers went upstairs into a Barmecide room that always had a great dining table in it and never had a dinner, and where even in the year 1780, the first letters written to you by your old love or by your little children were but newly released from the horror of being ogled through the windows by the heads exposed on Temple Bar, with an insensate brutality and ferocity worthy of Abyssinia or Ashanti. So again, just like how old-fashioned things are, how dark it is, things like that. But indeed, at that time, putting to death was a recipe much in vogue with all trades and professions, and not least of all with Tellson's. Death is nature's remedy for all things, and why not legislation's? Accordingly, the forger was put to death. The utterer of a bad note was put to death. The unlawful opener of a letter was put to death. The purloiner of 40 shillings and 6 was put to death. The holder of a horse at Tellson's door who made off with it was put to death. The coiner of a bad shilling was put to death. The sounder of 3/4 notes in the whole gamut of crime were put to death. Not that it did the least good in the way of prevention. It might have almost have been worth remarking that the fact was exactly the reverse, but it cleared off, as to this world, the trouble of each particular case, and left nothing else connected with it to be looked after. Thus, Tellson's, in its day, like greater places of business, its contemporaries had taken so many lives that if the heads laid low before it had been ranged on Temple Bar instead of being privately disposed of, they would have probably excluded the little light the ground floor had in a rather significant manner. Cramped in all kinds of dim cupboards and hutches, at Tellson's, the oldest of men carried on the business gravely. So this is people like Mr. Lorry. When they took a young man into Tellson's London house, they hid him somewhere till he was old. They kept him in a dark place like a cheese until he had the full Tellson's flavor and blue mold upon him. Then only was he permitted to be seen, particularly poring over large books and casting his breeches and gaiters into the general weight of the establishment. Outside Tellson's, never by any means in it, unless called in, was an odd job man. So that's who this chapter is actually about. So less about Tellson's. You get the point, right? It's old, it's gross. Any of the workers, it basically turns them old. What really we care about is what we're about to learn with Jerry Cruncher. An occasional porter or messenger who served as the live sign of the house. He was never absent during business hours, unless upon an errand, and then he was represented by his son, a grisly urchin of 12. So Jerry Cruncher has a son named Young Jerry, who was 12, who was his express image, who looks just like him. People understood that Tellson's, in a stately way, tolerated the odd job man. So Jerry Cruncher does not fit in with the other, people like Mr. Lorry, the other workers. The house had always tolerated some person in that capacity, and time and tide had drifted this person to the post. His surname was Cruncher, and on the youthful occasion of his renouncing by proxy the works of darkness in the easterly parish church of Houndsditch, he had received the added appellation of Jerry. So this is actually the first time I think you ever really hear his full name. It's Jerry Cruncher. The scene was Mr. Cruncher's private lodging in Hangingsworth Alley, Whitefriars. The time, 7:30 on a windy March morning, Anno Domini 1780. Mr. Cruncher himself always spoke of the year of our Lord as Anna Dominos, apparently under the impression that the Christian era dated from the invention of a popular game by a lady who had bestowed her name upon it. Jerry Cruncher lives in a sort of a poor section of London. And again, we've talked in class about he's kind of an idiot. So he thinks like AD, Anno Domini, stands for Anna Dominoes. Anyway, Mr. Cruncher's apartment was not in a savory neighborhood and were but 2 in number, so like a 2-bedroom apartment. Even if a closet with a single pane of glass, it might be counted as 1. But they were decently kept. Early as it was on this windy March morning, the room in which he lay abed was already scrubbed throughout, and between the cups and saucers arranged for breakfast and the lumbering deal table, a very clean white cloth was spread. Mr. Cruncher reposed under a patchwork counterpane like a harlequin at home. At first he slept heavily, but by degrees began to roll and surge in bed until he rose above the surface with his spiky hair looking as if it must tear the sheets to ribbons. At which juncture he exclaimed in a voice of dire exasperation, "Bust me if she ain't at it again." A woman of orderly and industrious appearance rose from her knees in the corner with sufficient haste and trepidation to show that she was the person referred to. "What?" said Mr. Cruncher, looking out of bed for a boot. "You're at it again, are you?" After hailing the morn with this second salutation, he threw a boot at the woman as a third. It was a very muddy boot, and may introduce the odd circumstance connected to Mr. Cruncher's domestic economy, which means job, that whereas he often came home after banking hours with clean boots, he often got up next morning to find the same boots covered with clay. So, he's asleep. He wakes up. His wife is in the corner on her knees saying a prayer. He takes his boot and he throws his boot at his wife. So automatically we know Jerry Cruncher is maybe not the best husband. But what's even more bizarre is this like weird circumstance. It says connected to his job. So there's something about what he does to make money where he goes home from the bank with clean boots and he wakes up in the morning with dirty boots. So think about the reasons that could happen. What's happening here? "What?" said Mr. Cruncher, varying his apostrophe after missing his mark. "What are you up to, aggravator?" And he doesn't, if you look at the word, he doesn't say aggravator, and again, it's just to show that he is less educated. I was only saying my prayers, says his wife. Saying your prayers? You're a nice woman. What do you mean by flopping yourself down and praying against me? I was not praying against you, I was praying for you. You weren't, and if you were, I won't be took the liberty with. Here, your mother's a nice woman, young Jerry, going a-praying against your father's prosperity. You've got a dutiful mother you have, my son. You've got a religious mother you have, my boy, going and flopping herself down and praying that the bread and butter may be snatched out of the mouth of her only child. So why would Jerry be mad about his wife saying prayers? Think about what the reason could be, and we'll talk about it in class. Master Cruncher, who was in his shirt, took this very ill, and turning to his mother, strongly deprecated any praying away of his personal board. And what do you suppose, you conceited female, said Mr. Cruncher with unconscious inconsistency, that the worth of your prayers may be? Name the price that you put your prayers at. They only come from the heart, Jerry. They are worth no more than that. Worth no more than that, repeated Mr. Cruncher. They ain't worth much then. Whether or no I won't be prayed again, I tell you. I can't afford it. I'm not going to be made unlucky by your sneaking. If you must go flopping yourself down, flop in favor of your husband and child, and not in opposition to him. If I had had any but an unnatural wife, and this boy had had any but an unnatural mother, I might have made some money last week, instead of being countermined, and religiously circumvented into the worst of luck. Bust me, said Mr. Cruncher, who all this time had been putting on his clothes, if I ain't, with piety and one blowed thing and another, been choused this week into as bad luck as ever a poor devil of an honest tradesman met with. Young Jerry, dress yourself, my boy, and while I clean my boots, keep an eye upon your mother now and then, and if you see any signs of more flopping, praying, give me a call. For I tell you, here, he addressed his wife once more, I won't be gone again in this manner. I'm as rickety as a hackney coach, I'm as sleepy as a laudanum, my lines is strained to that degree that I shouldn't know, and if it wasn't for the pain in 'em, which was me, and which somebody else, yet I'm none the better for it in pocket, and it's my suspicion that you've been at it again from morning to night to prevent me from being the better for it in pocket, and I won't put up with it, aggravator, and what do you say now? So whatever Jerry's doing at night is making him money sometimes, but why would his wife constantly be praying, and why does Jerry think that the wife is praying against him when she says she's praying for him? So just think about that. Growling in addition, such phrases as, ah, yes, you're religious too. You wouldn't put yourself in opposition to the interests of your husband and child, would you? Not you. And throwing off other sarcastic sparks from the whirling grindstone of his indignation. Mr. Cruncher betook himself to his boot cleaning and his general preparation for business. In the meantime, his son, whose head was garnished with tenderer spikes, and whose young eyes stood close by one another as his father's did, kept the required watch upon his mother. He greatly disturbed that poor woman at intervals by darting out of his sleeping closet where he made his toilet with a suppressed cry of, "You're going to flop, mother. Hello, father," and after raising this fictitious alarm, darting in again with an undutiful grin. So neither Jerry or young Jerry seems very kind to the mother, the wife. Mr. Cruncher's temper was not at all improved when he came to breakfast. He resented Mrs. Cruncher saying grace with particular animosity. "Now, aggravator, what are you up to? At it again?" His wife explained that she had merely asked a blessing. "Don't do it," said Mr. Cruncher, looking about as if he'd rather expected to see the loaf disappear under the efficacy of his wife's petitions. "I ain't a-going to be blessed out of house and home. I won't have my wittles blessed off my table. Keep still." Exceedingly red-eyed and grim, as if he'd been up all night at a party which had taken anything but a convivial turn, Jerry Cruncher worried his breakfast rather than ate it, growling over it like any four-footed inmate of a menagerie. Toward 9 o'clock he smoothed his ruffled aspect, and presenting as respectful and businesslike an exterior as he could overlay his natural self with, so he's not very businesslike normally, issued forth to the occupation of the day. So he's going to Tellson's because it's day. It could hardly be called a trade in spite of his favorite description of himself as an honest tradesman. His stock consisted of a wooden stool made out of a broken-backed chair cut down, which stool which stool young Jerry, walking at his father's side, carried every morning to beneath the banking house window that was nearest Temple Bar, where, with the addition of the first handful of straw that could be gleaned from any passing vehicle to keep the cold and wet from the odd job man's feet, it formed the encampment for the day. On this post of his, Mr. Cruncher was as well known to Fleet Street and the Temple as the bar itself, and was almost as ill-looking. So they sit outside Tellson's bank waiting for somebody from the bank to open up the door and give him a job for the day. Encamped at 9:15, in good time to touch his three-cornered hat to the oldest of men as they passed to Tellson's, Jerry took up his station on this windy March morning with a young Jerry standing by him, when not engaged in making forays through the bar, to inflict bodily and mental injuries of an acute description on passing boys who were small enough for his amiable purpose. Father and son, extremely like each other, looked silently on at the morning traffic in Fleet Street, with their two heads as near to one another as the two eyes of each bore a resemblance to a pair of monkeys. The resemblance was not lessened by the accidental circumstance that the mature Jerry bit and spat out straw, while the twinkling eyes of the youthful Jerry were as restlessly watchful of him as of everything on Fleet Street. The head of one of the regular indoor messengers attached to Tellson's establishment was put through the door, and the word was given. Porter wanted, "Hooray, father, here's an early job to begin with." Having thus given his parent Godspeed, young Jerry seated himself on the stool, entered on his reversionary interest in the straw his father had been chewing, and cogitated. "Always rusty. His fingers is always rusty," muttered young Jerry. "Where does my father get all that iron rust from? He don't get no rust here." So, second weird thing about Jerry Cruncher. So first is that he has muddy boots in the morning, even though they're clean when he goes to bed. And the second is that he has rust covering his hands. So think about where rust comes from. It comes from like iron or metal. And so for whatever reason, he has rust all over his hands. Also connected to whatever he's doing at night. And that's it.